Good evening. We are reading for charity. Forgot what the name of this was for a second here. And currently we're reading for the Archie Foundation. We're doing 100 of these reviews, 100 books donated by absolutely everyone. Raising money for the Archie Foundation. It's a fantastic charity. They predominantly deal with sick kids in the northeast of Scotland. If you've not seen any of these videos before, I give the same spiel at the start. It's starting to get slightly boring. It's a fantastic charity. If you've ever been in hospital as an adult, you know full well exactly how scary it can be going into hospital, especially if you're going into theatre. You know, it's cold, it's clinical, it's all very stainless steel, everyone's standing around wearing masks. It can be quite a frightening experience, even as an adult. So as a child going in there, it's a terrifying experience, and anything that can make these kids' lives a wee bit easier is, I think, a good thing. And that's what the Archie Foundation is trying to do. If you were aware of all the Ur Willie statues last summer, that was the Archie Foundation doing some fundraising, and this is just kind of following on from that. Anyway, so the aim of this is 100 books inside of a year read, and this is review number 10, which means I'm a tenth of the way through my list already, and that's gone very, very quickly. I mean, that's only 5 weeks, but to be 10% of the way through, that's quite fun. That's quite a big G up. That's quite a big yay. Let's go do this. Today, if you can't see the review title, is The Gunslinger. Again, I've been told to keep this back so I don't ruin the white balance in the video. Gunslinger by Stephen King. It's the start of the Dark Tower series. All 6 or 7 or 8 books. He's not entirely sure how many he's written or how many he's writing or how many he's going to write. It was an enjoyable book. I actually enjoyed going through this. It's not particularly big. It's only a couple hundred pages long, I think. Yeah, 238 pages. So for an intro to a massive fantasy epic, it's actually quite a short book. It's shorter than book one of Lord of the Rings. So if you've ever read the Lord of the Rings books, it's 3 books, but then each book is separated down into 3 separate books internally, and this is smaller than book 1 of book 1. So technically, if you think Lord of the Rings is 9 books, this is smaller than book 1 of that. So he wants it to be kind of the biggest fantasy novel, epic fantasy novel, once he's finished writing. And I think he had to do that by basically ramping up the word count in later books to beat the likes of Lord of the Rings. He kind of calls out Lord of the Rings a few times in his notes at the start, saying it's one of the books that he wants to be compared against. And he manages it in some of the right ways, and he manages it in some of the wrong ways, I think. The Gunslinger itself, and this is where it's going to be a bit of a fun and games, because actually restricting the review to only one of the books and not talking about what happens in, say, like the drawing of the 3 or Wastelands or further down the line is going to be kind of tricky, because I'm trying to restrict the review to this book and not the series as a whole. Otherwise, each of the next 7 reviews is just going to be, kind of what I said last week, but just with a little bit more on it. So just this book. He talks about in his foreword how we got grabbed by 2 things, and one was Lord of the Rings, and the other one was a Western. I want to say it was Guns and Navarone. I think it was Guns and Navarone. And those were the 2 influences for this book. It was what he really wanted to draw against for this book. Now, Lord of the Rings, I think he's not hit Lord of the Rings, but I think he's done it in a way that's acceptable. So in Lord of the Rings, it kind of very much starts off as Frodo's journey. It's the start of Frodo's journey, but it comes in the middle of Bilbo's story, if you like. If you take The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion and everything else as the extension of Bilbo's story, then you can understand Lord of the Rings being halfway through Bilbo's story. However, but it's really the start of Frodo's story. Now, the Gunslinger, he starts off halfway through the Gunslinger story. There's an awful lot of history to the Gunslinger. We're not starting off with him, fresh-eyed and bushy-tailed, heading off, happily skipping after the wizard. Or not so happily skipping after the wizard. He's very much, grim and weighed down by the effects his life that he's already lived has on him. Now, knowing a little bit about what comes next, it's very hard to remain completely spoiler-free when you're talking about one of the most popular fantasy series of all time. But he has obviously lived a long time, and it's alluded to repeatedly in the book how long he's lived. The man in black calls him effectively immortal, but then he calls himself effectively immortal and dies at the end of the book. So it's Stephen King being Stephen King. You get a hint as to the length of his quest when he talks about his homeland has completely gone to ruin, and you kind of get the feeling that it went to ruin a long time ago. So you think that you already get the hints of the length of his journey straight away from the book, which I know is expanded on later. Stephen King's writing style, let's just take a little jaunt down that way, is interesting. He says himself he doesn't really stop writing. He just keeps going. He just batters out the pages, batters out the pages, batters out the pages. He says in his forenote he doesn't like going back to edit a book until he's completely finished writing his book. Because your writers who edit never actually finish, and he wants to finish books, which I actually think is quite admirable. But you also kind of get the feeling that when he sits down and says finished, and he goes back and reads it, he kind of goes, well, okay, this could have been improved in places, but this is against my philosophy, ship it. Which means the book kind of does occasionally get a little bit meandering in places, even for such a short book. And I think that's due to Stephen King's style. This is the slightly extended version, so this is not the first edition of the book. It's far, far, far down there. But he says he's added 35 pages and trimmed a little bit of the fat in other places. I think I can see some of the joins. I couldn't see all of them, but I think I can see some of the joins. Particularly the stuff around Jake. I think he foreshadows a little bit of what comes on in some of the later books, with how he treats Jake in this book. I think some of that stuff's been added. I think there's been a couple of little bits been added. The drawing of the 3 bits, the prophecies that the Man in Black makes near the end of the book. I think it's one of those stylistic things that you find kind of fantasy authors, and fantasy GMs, if you ever do any role playing, it's a similar kind of idea. Someone kind of sits down and says, right, and they think of a prophecy, and you're just going, right, so there's going to be, this is going to happen, but not for you, and this is going to happen, and something awesome and cool, maybe, and death always appears in these things. Death happens, but I can't kill you off, so it's not death, but it is death, but it's not for you. Move on. And the ending of that book really is kind of a little bit down those lines. You don't, knowing that he wrote the second novel, The Drawing of 3, way after he wrote The Gunslinger, and knowing the fact that Stephen King doesn't plan his novels out, it is very much the kind of, you kind of finish the book and you go, alright, okay, so how on earth are you going to draw that tarot together in further books? And we'll talk about that when we come to The Drawing of the 3. The story itself is, it's interesting because actually very little happens in it, and I think this is partially due to the Western element that he wanted to include. So the Gunslinger's time in Tull, for example, is kind of out of kilter with the rest of the book and what I've read of the rest of the series, in that it's the Gunslinger actually in an environment with many other people. And the events of Tull, giving no spoilers as much as I can, the events in Tull, you walk out there going, okay, that's very Western. I can see, epic Western, fantasy mixed with Western, in Tull, yes, right, okay, let's go for more of that. And then he takes a completely 90-degree turn, and it becomes more of a kind of Greek-style epic, in that it's the single hero wandering through the land, possibly with a sidekick. In this case, he does indeed pick up a sidekick. But it becomes far more Grecian in the style of epic he's chosen, rather than the the Nordic style, which was Tolkien's influences for the style of epic he chose. So yeah, I think he takes the Western and he takes the Lord of the Rings at the start of the book, and then as soon as Tull happens, it kind of gets tossed aside and it comes into something else. And again, I think this is partially due to Stephen King's writing style, but I actually think the book is better off for that. It becomes something far more interesting. It's not as formulaic as some of the other big fantasy novels, and I'm thinking of things like The Wheel of Time. The Wheel in Time is massively fantasy formulaic. You can see what's going to happen, even in the journey elements in things like The Wheel of Time. There's always the same things happen. The random attacks, the bandits, you stumble across a village and nothing is quite what it seems like. The typical kind of fantasy tropes that you get through these novels. And in The Gunslinger, none of that happens. However, none of much else happens either. There's quite a lot of walking, and there's quite a lot of almost dying of thirst, and there's quite a lot of almost dying of hunger. And he manages to fill probably the better part of 100 pages just walking. And you don't kind of get to the end of those 100 pages and go, well, that was a waste of 100 pages. You get to the end of the 100 pages and going, oh, that was actually quite enjoyable. I quite enjoyed that. You almost died repeatedly to environmental hazards, which are probably the most boring thing to actually to read about. If you ever do any role-playing games, it's along a similar basis. Whenever you're travelling from point A to point B, trying to make that interesting as a games master is a very, very hard thing to do for other people. And as a writer, it has exactly the same problems. How do you make travelling from point A to point B interesting? Most people would just go, meh, you arrive in point B, there were some adventures, you don't really need to know about it. Stephen King's actually taken a whole book about walking from point A to point B. And technically, I suppose the whole series is about walking from point A to point B if you make point B the Dark Tower. And he's made it genuinely interesting. He's made very few random events happen on the way, but working through the Gunslinger's thoughts and him working around environmental problems and the things that happen with Jake, and he starts weaving in all the extra things you need to know about the Gunslinger, about his hatred of the Man in Black, and a little bit about his past. And this is where I slightly get fuzzy because I can't remember how much of his past is in this book and how much of it's in the Drawing of the Three. I think most of it's in the Gunslinger. But it's really well written for taking out of for taking the book away from the kind of Nordic fantasy that's Tolkien, and he moves away from the Western style as well. He still has the Gunslinger, but the Gunslinger is not the moralistic kind of Western character that you see a lot of people playing. I kill for revenge, or I kill because you killed me, or I kill in self-defense. The Gunslinger in this book is very much the utter pragmatist. It's, you're standing in my way, and if you don't get in my way, I'm going to kill you. He in most of the westerns, and certainly modern westerns, he would be viewed as the villain rather than as the hero of the film. So I think it's a fantastically interesting take on not just the main character, who is relatable yet unrelatable in terms of his experiences and his abilities, etc. But you don't mind being in Roland's head. You can quite happily walk along the book as he's almost dying of hunger, as he's almost dying of thirst, as he sits and knows what's going to happen to Jake after he meets Jake. His hatred of the Man in Black. You walk along beside him, and it's good. It's he's completely unrepentant about his ability to kill people. He will kill people and not look back. I think there's elements in this book that gets tossed away later on, and because I won't talk about them later, I'll talk about them now. But all the way through the Gunslinger, his hatred of the Man in Black is kind of like the driving factor. To the extent where he sees him against some rocks, and the gun's out of his hand and he's firing before his brain registers that he's seen the Man in Black. And yet, when he gets to the end of the book, and he doesn't kill the Man in Black. The Man in Black dies of, inverted commas, natural causes. It's kind of like a weird bit of the book where it suggests he wakes up 10 years later, and the Man in Black is just a a skeleton sitting beside the fire that's still burning, and it's like, okay, you kind of gone into the trippy LSD side of fantasy novels here, but that's okay, that's fine. But he kind of denies the next book. You get to the end of this one, and it's obviously this has been written as a one-off initially, and then he continues with the story many years later. Denying, as a one-off novel, denying Roland the death of the Man in Black by his own hand is never then mentioned in the later novels, at least not so far as I've read. And I'm sure it should be absolutely infuriating to Roland that the Man in Black died, but not at his hand. He's supposedly travelled, halfway across the world, or halfway across the worlds, to find the Man in Black and kill him. He meets the Man in Black, they sit down in front of fire, and he wakes up and the Man in Black is dead. Or maybe not, given the way that the books tend to go, you can never guarantee who's dead or who's not. But it should be eating Roland up at the start of the next book or future books. It is mentioned that he has an emotional core, with the pragmatism sitting as a shell outside, and not killing them in black should be eating him up, and it's not. And I think that's the only criticism I think I have about the Gunslinger as a standalone novel, not necessarily as the start of something grand, is the ending of the book is just a little bit vague, a little bit woolly, a little bit, you should have let him kill the Man in Black. But it is what it is. I've waffled a lot. Should you read this book? Yes, you should definitely read this book, and you should continue reading the Dark Tower books. I'm partway through the Wastelands just now, and I've really enjoyed them so far. I've really enjoyed them. I'll be reading about the next one. I'll be talking about the next one on Wednesday. But the Dark Tower, fantastic novel. I do recommend picking it up and reading it if you've not done so before. Yes. Anyway, right. Next week, Wednesday, will be the drawing of the 3. Put this back up. There we go. Drawing of the 3. Which I finished already. I'm trying to keep ahead of the game on these books because they get quite chunky, and trying to keep up a Wednesday Sunday schedule will be hard when I get down to reading some of the kind of 850, 900 page books near the end of the series. So I'm trying to keep out in front of this as much as possible. So that will be Wednesday's review. So just to finish up, this is Reading for Charity. We're reading 100 books in a year for charity. The current charity we're reading for is the Archie Foundation. It's a fantastic charity. They deal primarily with sick kids in the northeast of Scotland. They help the kids who are in hospital for no fault of their own. It's a great charity. They do a lot of good work. And if you've donated to them before, maybe through this, thank you very much. Please donate again. I know it's past payday. I know everyone's got some money in their pocket. Throw them a couple of quid. It's fantastic. If you've never donated before, what's stopped you so far? A couple of quid their way, and it will help some sick kids, and that's something we can all get behind. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I can see there's a couple of people appeared in chat, but no one said anything. More people in the chat would be great. More people saying things in chat would be fantastic. I'm going to hang around for a couple of minutes once the stream ends, just see if anybody actually says anything. But if not, thank you very much for watching, and hopefully you'll join us on Wednesday for the drawing of the 3. Thank you very much.